So, what's the most dangerous thing that you have done? Said something rude to your mother-in-law? Eating something that was past its use-by date? Driving past the petrol station whilst the petrol light was on in your car? You know, most of us are not really doing dangerous things on a regular basis. But this series is all about something many of us do all the time, but perhaps without realising just how dangerous it is. We're talking about dangerous prayers. And I know what you're thinking. Prayer isn't dangerous. It's safe. You know, on the danger scale, we'd put it alongside things like having a cup of tea or watching television. It's not exactly high risk, high danger stuff. But perhaps that's because we've been praying safe prayers. When we think about what we're doing when we pray, we start to see how dangerous it could be. We're connecting with God, the creator of the universe, the most powerful person, force, substance, however you want to describe God, in the universe, the God who is beyond limits. And when we pray, we're trying to tap into his power and his presence. We're asking him to get involved, to move. We're attempting to stir him into action. That is where the danger comes in. We think prayer is safe because often it's a passive experience. We sit and we talk to God, not really sure if he's listening, and then we go about our day. Nothing much has changed. But that's not prayer. Prayer is anything but passive. It isn't about delegating a bunch of stuff to God, giving him a to-do list to follow. Prayer, true prayer, should stir God, and it should stir us. It should move God, and it should move us. Throughout this series, we're looking at 4 simple prayers that we can pray. Now, they may be simple, but they're anything but simplistic. They are prayers that move the heart of God. We've already looked at the prayer, "Search me." If you missed it, you can catch up on our YouTube channel. Today, I want us to look at a 2-word prayer that I'm pretty sure none of us really want to pray because it definitely should come with a health warning. If you've been a follower of Jesus for some time, you will know that there are verses in the Bible that we like to take hold of and apply to ourselves. They're encouraging and uplifting and something we want to share with others and speak over the people we care about. That's a good thing to do. Jeremiah 29 verse 11 is a classic example of this. I've heard many people share it with others. It says this: "For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not harm you. Plans to give you a hope and a future." Such wonderful and encouraging words. I long for God to speak that over me. I want some of those plans that are there to prosper me and not to harm me. I want to encounter the plans that God has that will give me hope and a future. And I'm sure we all do. Give me a wave if you've memorized that verse. That's a good thing to do. Now, give me a wave if you've memorized Jeremiah 7:20. Anyone? I think it's a safe bet that you haven't, and that this isn't a verse that you've shared with other people. It says this: "This is what the sovereign Lord says. My anger and my wrath will be poured out on this place, on man and beast, on trees of the field, and on the crops of your land, and it will burn and not be quenched." I think I want to go back to 29:11. That was far more encouraging and far more uplifting. Now, this is really important. Make sure you don't miss this. You can't have the promise of Jeremiah 29:11 without the judgment of Jeremiah 7:20. The book of Jeremiah has this dual message of judgment and grace. Jeremiah was a prophet that God sent to Israel to declare God's judgment and wrath, but also to point to God's grace and the hope that he offers. The nation of Israel had continuously rebelled against God. They worshipped false idols and they didn't live in a way that he established them as a nation to live. So God eventually hands them over to an invading force, the Babylonians. And they'll come in and they'll destroy Jerusalem and take a bunch of her inhabitants away into exile. But then God will rescue Israel, will deliver them from Babylon and bring them back home. That's the promise of 29:11. You really should read the whole book to get a picture of what God is doing through all of this. Israel needed to be brought low, to be broken before it could be rebuilt. They had to go through this pain before they could experience the joy, the hope, and the healing that God had for them. Indeed, that promise of plans to prosper and not to harm, to give them hope in a future, carried far more weight because of what they'd gone through. The message of Jeremiah highlights the problem of sin and its consequence. It separates us from God. It causes us to drift away from him. We live in a different time to the people of Jeremiah's day. We live in a world that is after the coming of Jesus. This judgment that Jeremiah proclaims over the nation of Israel is one that is due to all of us. But Jesus, being in very nature God, chose to take that judgment onto himself so we don't have to endure it. We get left to receive the blessing that comes from the message of grace without having to deal with the consequence of God's judgment. But that doesn't mean that life is plain sailing. It doesn't mean that there aren't times where we experience hardships and suffering. And it doesn't mean that God isn't at work when life gets tough. So what has all this got to do with what we're talking about? What is the dangerous prayer that moves God and moves us? Now, are you ready for this? This is what I think God wants you to pray after you've prayed, "Search me." You're not going to like it. Break me. Break me, God. Now, who's up for praying that? There are times when in order to experience the promise and fullness of God, you need to first allow God to break you and then gently and graciously put you back together again. Who's up for a bit of that? I remember talking to a friend a few years ago who was going through some really tough situations and difficulties. I was wondering what words I could offer him that would help and encourage him. And he said to me, "Chris, it's like God has broken me and is slowly putting the pieces back together again." It's a wonderful image, but it's not much fun to live through. I sense that many of us are feeling pretty broken at the moment. What we have gone through and continue to endure has been tough and painful. And we're not at a place where we can simply say to God, "Break me," because it feels like he's already done that. Let me speak into that for a moment. I know what it's like to feel broken. There's been so much going on over this last year or so that just piles up. It's not one thing, it's a whole bunch of things that build on top of each other. And you get to that point where you feel you've come to the end of yourself and you've got nowhere else to go and nothing left to give. Does that sound familiar at all? That is both a dangerous and wonderful place to be. Mark shares an experience that Jesus' first followers had that I think speaks into what it's like to be in that place of brokenness. It's the end of a busy day, and the disciples and Jesus climb into a boat and head out across the Sea of Galilee. It's in chapter 4 of Mark's Gospel. Now, verse 36 has this simple phrase that I've often overlooked in the many times that I've read this passage. It says this: "Leaving the crowd behind, they," that's the disciples, "took him along," that's Jesus, "just as he was in the boat." Did you spot it? Just as he was. I've never really noticed that before. They went with Jesus just as he was. We had friends over for dinner the other day. It was so lovely. They asked what could they bring, and our response was, "Just bring yourselves. Just come as you are. You don't need to do anything or bring anything or act differently. Just be yourselves." God welcomes us like that, just as we are. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to be someone we're not. He welcomes us just as we are. But how willing are we to welcome him just as he is? How willing are we to follow Jesus just as he is? I think often we want Jesus to be just as we are, not just as he is. We want to create God in our own image. We want him to fit into the box that we've created for him. We want to follow him on our terms. How willing are you to accept Jesus just as he is? To follow Jesus just as he is? How willing are you to allow Jesus to change you rather than you trying to change Jesus, to fit with the image you've created for him? An image that doesn't require too much of you. An image that doesn't require you to change or step out of your comfort zone. Anyway, they set out in the boat to cross the Sea of Galilee. It's the middle of the night and all of a sudden this big storm rolls in. Now, this wasn't the first storm that these guys had encountered, but it was bigger than what they'd been through before. The waves crashed over the edge of the boat and they were buffeted by the wind. They thought they were going to capsize and drown. I can picture the disciples running about on this boat, trying to keep it afloat, bailing out the water and doing whatever they can just to survive. And what is Jesus doing in all of this? Well, he's asleep on a cushion. Everything is crashing down around them and Jesus is asleep. Does that sound familiar? Does it feel like the waters are coming over the side of your boat, that you're close to drowning, but that Jesus is sleeping? You know God is with you because he's promised to be with you, but he doesn't seem to be doing anything. You know, I've certainly felt that. Stuff piles up around me and it feels like I'm close to going under. I know God is there, but it feels like he's asleep. At times I feel utterly broken and beyond myself. You know, whatever that means. And yet Jesus is still asleep. Doesn't he care? Can't he see what I'm going through? Can't he see what I'm facing? Why is Jesus asleep in the boat in the middle of a storm? Well, simply because he isn't worried or concerned. He is calm. He's at peace. And we know that this isn't because he didn't or he doesn't care. You know, when his close friend Lazarus had died, Jesus experienced grief and loss. He was moved by the grief that Lazarus's friends were experiencing. And we're told simply that Jesus wept. Jesus knew what was about to happen. He knew that he would bring Lazarus back to life, but he still experienced that grief. He cares. The disciples go to Jesus and they wake him up and they say, "Don't you care if we drown? Now, are you in this boat? Is this what life is like for you at times right now? Are you trying to wake Jesus up? Are you saying to him, don't you care if I drown?" If that's the case, if this is what you're going through right now, then I want you to picture this with me. You're in the boat, you're in the storm, and Jesus is asleep. You nudge him and you shake him awake. And as he opens his eyes, you scream at him, "Don't you care if we drown?" He looks at you with compassion and just a glint of frustration. And slowly he stands to his feet. But he's bigger than you thought he was. As he stands up, he towers over you. It's a bit like Frodo standing next to Gandalf in The Lord of the Rings. And he simply says, "Quiet, be still." There is so much authority in his voice. He doesn't have to shout. He just speaks it. He proclaims it. And all of a sudden, it's quiet and still. The wind has gone. The waves have died down. And all is calm. Whatever it is that is causing you to feel like you're on a boat in the middle of a storm that is about to be swamped has gone. Jesus has spoken those words over that situation. Quiet. Be still. The difficult relationship, the health scare, the worry about finances, the problem at work, whatever it is, Jesus has spoken into it. He has declared, "Quiet, be still." And it is. That's the hope. That's the plans that God has for you. That's the Jeremiah 29:11 promise that we want to apply to our own situations. That is what I'm looking towards and holding out for. That is where my hope is what I believe God will do. But right now, I'm in the boat, I'm in the storm, Jesus is asleep, and I'm trying to wake him up. My point is that we can't experience the calming of the storm without first living through it. But there is more in the storm than simply the hope that one day it will pass. We learn so much from it. We discover something that can't be discovered in the calm waters. There is power and blessing in the storm. There is grace and compassion to be found in brokenness. God is found in the storm. God is discovered through brokenness. Craig Rochelle says, "We don't realise what blessings may be on the other side of God's breaking." Now, I'm not saying that what you're experiencing is because of God, but for whatever reason, God is allowing you to endure it. In times like these, I hold on to the promise of Romans 8:28. We know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him. God is working for your good in the midst of the storm, in the midst of the brokenness. Even if you can't see it or feel it, he's at work. There's another Christian author called Brennan Manning who has written a blessing that my mentor often shares with me. It goes like this: May all your expectations be frustrated. May all your plans be thwarted. May all your desires be withered into nothingness, that you may experience the powerlessness and poverty of a child and sing and dance in the love of God, who is the Father, Son, and Spirit. Now, none of us want this, but I hope we can see the opportunity that comes from times like these. The storms and frustrations of our lives present us with a choice. Do we run around like headless chickens, panicking and trying to solve the problem by ourselves? Or do we go to Jesus, wake him up and say to him, "Don't you care if I drown?" When we do this, when we go to Jesus at times like these, we discover that he does care. We discover that he wants us to experience the calmness and stillness. He wants us to have peace. But perhaps there's something else we can do in the midst of the storm. As we start to panic and become aware of whatever it is that is causing us to feel like we're about to sink, and we wonder where Jesus is and what he's doing, and it seems like he's asleep, instead of kicking him awake, ask yourself, why is he asleep? I know it isn't because he doesn't care, so perhaps it's because he isn't worried, even though I am. He is calm, he has perspective, and he knows that all will be well. Even though the storm rages on around us, Jesus is asleep. He is calm and at peace because he knows something we don't know. He sees something we can't see. In those times, go to him, wake him. He will slowly get to his feet. You will see he is so much bigger than you thought he was. But instead of speaking to the wind and the waves, he will look you in the eye and speak to the depth of your soul. Quiet. Be still. The wind rages on. The waves continue to crash over the edge of the boat. But in that moment, you experience the calmness and peace, the stillness that Jesus has for you. You can be quiet and still, even though nothing on the outside has changed, but everything on the inside has shifted. You're still broken, but now you're in a place where God can gently and graciously put you back together again. So that's my prayer for you, that in those moments of brokenness, you are able to hear and encounter those words from Jesus, quiet, be still. That you can hear them over the wind and the waves, and that they can penetrate deep into your heart. You might not want to pray, break me, but know that there is blessing and hope and promise on the other side of being broken that can't be discovered without it.